The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Ravencrest Manor with an insistence that matched the Duke's irritation. Alexander Blackthorne stood in his mahogany-panelled study, steel-grey eyes fixed on the dreary Yorkshire countryside beyond the glass. The year 1815 had brought Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, but it had also brought unwanted changes to his carefully ordered world. "Your Grace," came a soft voice from the doorway. He turned to see Mrs. Henderson, his housekeeper, accompanied by a young woman whose modest grey dress and practical bonnet immediately marked her as a governess. "May I present Miss Isabella Thornfield, the new governess for Lady Catherine?" Alexander's gaze swept over the young woman with the cool assessment he reserved for all servants. She was taller than most, with an elegance that seemed incongruous with her humble attire. Her green eyes met his directly, and boldness that both annoyed and intrigued him. "Miss Thornfield," his voice carried the authority of generations of nobility, "I trust you understand the expectations for Lady Catherine's education. She is spirited." Isabella inclined her head slightly, but there was no servile deference in her manner. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace. Spirited children often possess the greatest potential once properly guided." Something in her tone, educated, refined, caught his attention. Most governesses of his acquaintance spoke with careful deference, yet this woman addressed him as an equal might. The presumption stirred his temper. "You seem remarkably confident for someone in your position," he said, each word precisely enunciated. "I wonder if you truly comprehend the vast difference between your station and mine, Miss Thornfield." A flush of colour touched her porcelain cheeks, but her chin lifted with unmistakable pride. "I am well aware of social distinctions, Your Grace. However, I believe a child's education benefits from a teacher who possesses both knowledge and dignity." The audacity of it struck him like a physical blow. No servant had ever dared speak to him so boldly. His jaw tightened as he moved closer, close enough to see the golden flecks in her remarkable eyes. "Let me make something perfectly clear, Miss Thornfield," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You may possess education and dignity, as you so eloquently put it, but you will never, ever enter my heart. You are here to serve, nothing more. Do not mistake my tolerance for anything deeper." Isabella's face went pale, but her gaze never wavered. "I would not presume to aspire to such lofty heights, Your Grace. I am here for Lady Catherine, not for your heart." The slight emphasis she placed on the last word suggested she doubted he possessed one at all. Alexander felt his control slip further, a rare occurrence that unsettled him profoundly. "See that you remember that," he said curtly, then turned back to his desk in clear dismissal. After the women left, Alexander found himself unable to concentrate on his correspondence. The governess's face lingered in his mind, those extraordinary eyes, the way she'd refused to be cowed by his deliberate cruelty. He told himself it was merely annoyance at her impertinence, nothing more. But as the days passed, he found himself increasingly aware of Isabella's presence in his house. He would catch glimpses of her in the gardens with Catherine, teaching his ward about botany while they collected autumn leaves. Her laughter, when she thought no one was listening, had a musical quality that seemed to brighten even the gloomiest corridors of Ravencrest Manor. "She's quite remarkable," Lady Margaret Ashworth observed one afternoon, as she took tea with Alexander in the blue drawing-room. Margaret was one of the few people whose opinion he valued. Her sharp wit and genuine friendship, a rare commodity in their social circle. "Who?" Alexander asked, though he knew perfectly well whom she meant. "Miss Thornfield, of course. Catherine adores her already. And I must say, her conversation at dinner last evening was most enlightening. Such knowledge of literature and history, quite unusual for a governess." Alexander's cup rattled slightly against its saucer as he set it down. "Many governesses are well educated, Margaret. It's hardly remarkable. Perhaps, But there's something different about her, the way she carries herself, her manner of speaking. If I didn't know better, I'd say she was born to better circumstances. That evening, Alexander found himself drawn to the library, where he often encountered Isabella after Catherine's bedtime. She sat in a leather chair near the fireplace, completely absorbed in a volume of Byron's poetry. The flickering light cast golden highlights in her hair, which she'd allowed to escape its usual severe styling. "Enjoying Byron, Miss Thornfield?" he asked, making her start. She quickly moved to rise, but he gestured for her to remain seated. "Yes, Your Grace, though I find his romantic idealism rather naive." Despite himself, Alexander was intrigued. How so? He speaks of love as though it conquers all obstacles, transforms everything it touches. In reality, love is often the source of our greatest pain. Her voice carried a note of sadness that made him study her more carefully. "You speak from experience?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Isabella's fingers tightened on the book. "I speak from observation, Your Grace. Love makes us vulnerable, exposes our weaknesses to those who might exploit them." Alexander felt an uncomfortable recognition in her words. Had he not built his own defences for precisely that reason? Lady Vivien Hartwell's betrayal 3 years prior had taught him the danger of trusting one's heart to another. "A remarkably cynical view for someone so young," he observed. "And a remarkably naive view for someone who claims to be beyond love's reach," she countered, then immediately looked stricken. "Forgive me, Your Grace. That was impertinent." But Alexander found himself almost smiling. Indeed it was, yet not entirely inaccurate. Something shifted between them in that moment, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. He saw answering warmth in her eyes before she quickly looked away, back to her book. From that evening forward, their encounters took on a different quality. Alexander found himself lingering in the library, engaging her in discussions about literature, philosophy, politics. Isabella's intelligence was undeniable, her insights often surprising him with their depth and originality. "You argue like someone trained in Oxford halls, not governess schools," he observed one evening after a particularly spirited debate about parliamentary reform. Isabella's hand stilled on the page she was turning. "I was fortunate in my education." How fortunate? But she merely smiled enigmatically and changed the subject. Lord Sebastian Grey arrived for his monthly visit on a particularly grey November morning, bringing with him his customary cheerful energy and an insatiable curiosity about Alexander's household changes. "So this is the famous governess Margaret mentioned," Sebastian murmured as they watched Isabella and Catherine practicing pianoforte in the music room. "I must say, Alex, she's quite lovely. And Catherine seems transformed, actually sitting still for longer than 5 minutes. Alexander's jaw tightened at Sebastian's appreciative tone. "She's an adequate teacher." "Adequate? Good God, man, are you blind? The woman's stunning. And did you hear her playing just now? That was Chopin, complex pieces that require years of training. Many governesses play piano, Sebastian. Not like that, they don't." Sebastian shot him a knowing look. "What aren't you telling me?" Before Alexander could respond, Catherine came bounding over, having spotted her favorite visitor. "Uncle Sebastian, Miss Isabella was just teaching me about composers. Did you know Chopin is only 5 years older than Papa?" Was she indeed, Sebastian's eyes twinkling with mischief. "And what else has the accomplished Miss Isabella been teaching you?" "Oh, everything. French, Latin, mathematics, botany. She speaks 3 languages and knows more about history than Papa's tutor ever did. And she's teaching me to ride properly, not that silly side-saddle nonsense." Alexander frowned. A governess who spoke 3 languages, played advanced piano pieces, and taught unconventional riding techniques was indeed unusual. But before he could pursue the thought, Isabella approached their group. "Lord Grey," she said with a graceful curtsy. "Catherine, perhaps we should continue your lessons." "Actually, Miss Thornfield," Sebastian interjected with his most charming smile, "I was hoping you might join us for tea. I'm curious about your thoughts on the current political climate." Isabella glanced uncertainly at Alexander, who found himself nodding despite his better judgment. As the four of them settled in the drawing room, Sebastian launched into his interrogation with characteristic enthusiasm. "Margaret tells me you have fascinating opinions on parliamentary reform," he began. "I believe education and representation should not be limited by birthright alone," Isabella replied carefully. "Though I understand such views may seem radical to some." "Radical? Nonsense! I quite agree, don't you, Alex?" Alexander found himself studying Isabella's profile as she spoke passionately about social reform. There was something in her manner, her knowledge of political intricacies, that suggested more than theoretical interest. She spoke like someone who had personal stakes in these issues. "You seem remarkably well informed about parliamentary procedures," Alexander observed. A fleeting expression crossed Isabella's face. Was it fear? I enjoy reading the newspapers, Your Grace." But Sebastian, ever perceptive, had caught something more. "Forgive me, Miss Thornfield, but you speak with the authority of someone who's witnessed these procedures firsthand. Have you spent time in London?" Isabella's cup trembled slightly in her hands. "I lived there briefly, as a child." Alexander felt a growing certainty that there were layers to Isabella Thornfield's story that she was deliberately concealing. But before he could pursue the matter, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Your Grace, there's a gentleman here to see Miss Thornfield. Says it's urgent family business." Isabella went very pale, her cup clattering onto its saucer. I should see what he wants." "Nonsense," Alexander said, rising. "If it's urgent, bring him in, Mrs. Henderson." "Your Grace, that's really not necessary," Isabella began, but her protest was cut short as a distinguished gentleman in his 50s entered the room. His bearing and expensive attire immediately marked him as nobility, and Alexander felt his confusion deepen. "Edward," Isabella whispered, and there was something almost frightened in her voice. "My dear child," the man said, taking her hands gently, "I'm afraid I bring news that cannot wait." Alexander stepped forward. "I am Ravencrest. Miss Thornfield is in my employ. If there's a family emergency—" The gentleman, Edward, looked between Isabella and Alexander with sharp intelligence. "Your Grace, I am Edward Thornfield, Isabella's uncle and legal guardian. I'm afraid there's been a development that requires her immediate attention in London." "What kind of development?" Alexander demanded, though he had no right to ask. Isabella looked stricken. "Edward, please, not here." "I'm afraid it can't wait, my dear. The Chancery Court has made its final ruling. The Ashbridge estate is yours." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander felt the room tilt slightly as the implications hit him. Ashbridge, one of the wealthiest estates in England. Isabella wasn't just a governess. She was an heiress, a very wealthy heiress who had been living as a servant in his house. "I don't understand," Sebastian said, voicing what they were all thinking. Edward Thornfield looked at his niece with gentle compassion. "Isabella is the daughter of the late Earl of Ashbridge. She's been living in reduced circumstances to avoid fortune hunters and those who might seek to control her inheritance. But the legal battles are over now. She is one of the wealthiest young women in England." Alexander felt as though he'd been struck by lightning. Every conversation, every moment of connection he'd felt with Isabella suddenly took on new meaning. She hadn't been a governess at all. She'd been playing a role, hiding her true identity. The woman he'd told would never enter his heart was actually so far above his station socially that their positions were almost reversed. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Isabella met his gaze with visible anguish. Always. I've always known who I was. And you said nothing. You let me treat you like a servant, let me believe. He stopped, unable to continue as fury and hurt warred within him. Alex, Sebastian began, but Alexander held up a hand for silence. Did you find it amusing? Alexander's voice was controlled, but Isabella could hear the wounded rage beneath, watching the arrogant duke make a fool of himself. It wasn't like that, Isabella said desperately. I never meant for things to become complicated. Complicated? Alexander laughed bitterly. Is that what you call it? I told you that you would never enter my heart, Miss Thornfield, or should I say, Lady Isabella. It seems the joke is on me. You were never trying to enter anything. You were merely slumming with the lesser nobility. The cruelty of his words hung in the air like a physical presence. Isabella flinched as though he'd struck her, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. That's not fair, she whispered. You know that's not how it was between us. Do I? How am I supposed to know anything about how it was between us when everything you've told me has been a lie? Edward Thornfield stepped protectively closer to his niece. Your Grace, I think you're being rather harsh. Isabella's circumstances required discretion. Did they require her to take employment in my house, under false pretenses? To accept wages for work she never needed to perform? To make a mockery of... Alexander stopped himself before he could say something he might regret more than he already did. Isabella drew herself up with visible effort, wiping her tears away. You're right, Your Grace. I should have told you. I should have left when I began to... when things changed between us. That was my mistake. When things changed between us. Alexander seized on the phrase. What exactly changed, Lady Isabella? Because from where I stand, nothing has changed except my understanding of how thoroughly I've been deceived. The pain in Isabella's eyes was unmistakable now. Everything changed. My feelings changed. I began to care for you, which was never part of the plan. I began to hope that perhaps... She stopped, shaking her head. But it doesn't matter now. Hope for what? Alexander demanded, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. That you might come to care for me as well. Not as a duke regards a governess, but as a man might care for a woman. But I see now how foolish that hope was. Alexander felt something crack inside his chest. The raw honesty in her voice, the vulnerability she was showing him even as he wounded her, it was exactly what he'd been afraid of. Exactly why he'd built walls around his heart in the first place. You're right, he said, his voice hollow. It was foolish. Because even now, knowing who you are, I find I cannot trust a single thing you've said or done. How can I believe your feelings are genuine when everything else about you has been a performance? Isabella seemed to crumble at his words, but she straightened her shoulders with visible effort. You cannot, and I don't blame you for that. I made my choice when I accepted the position here, and I must live with the consequences. Edward cleared his throat uncomfortably. Isabella, we really must return to London. There are legal matters that require your attention and social obligations to consider. Alexander watched as Isabella transformed before his eyes. The woman who had argued politics with him, who had laughed with Catherine in the gardens, who had challenged him intellectually and emotionally, that woman seemed to fade away, replaced by a poised, distant lady of the nobility. Of course, Uncle Edward. I'll gather my things immediately. She turned to Catherine, who had been watching the adult drama with wide, confused eyes. Goodbye, sweetheart. Continue practicing your piano and remember what I taught you about sitting tall. But Miss Isabella, you can't leave. Who will teach me about the stars? Who will help me with my Latin? Catherine's voice rose in distress. Isabella knelt to embrace the child, and Alexander saw her composure crack slightly. You'll have a new governess soon, one much better than I ever was. I don't want a new governess. I want you. Catherine looked between Isabella and Alexander with the devastating clarity of youth. Papa, make her stay. You like her, I know you do. Alexander felt as though his heart was being crushed. Lady Isabella has other obligations now, Catherine. Important ones. Isabella rose, unable to look at him directly. Your Grace, thank you for the opportunity to serve in your household. I hope you'll find someone more suitable for Catherine's needs. The formality of her words was like salt in an open wound. This was what he'd demanded from the beginning, proper deference, acknowledgement of their different stations, but now that he had it, it felt like death. Sebastian, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the confrontation, finally spoke up. Perhaps everyone should take some time to process this news. Emotions are running high. There's nothing to process. Alexander cut him off. Lady Isabella has made her position clear, and I have made mine. I wish her well in her new circumstances. Adieu, but as Isabella walked toward the door with her uncle, Alexander felt panic rising in his chest. She was leaving. Actually leaving, and he might never see her again. The thought was unbearable, even as his pride demanded he let her go. Isabella, he called out, using her given name for the first time. She turned, hope flickering in her eyes. Yes? For a moment Alexander stood on the brink of everything, of forgiveness, of vulnerability, of admitting that she had indeed entered his heart completely. But the memory of Vivien's betrayal rose like a spectre between them, reminding him of the cost of trusting too freely. Nothing, he said finally. Safe travels. The hope died in Isabella's eyes, replaced by a resignation that cut him deeper than any accusation could have. She inclined her head formally and left without another word. After their departure, Alexander found himself alone in his study, staring at the chair where Isabella used to sit and read in the evenings. The house felt hollow, as though some essential warmth had been drained from it. "You're a damned fool, Alex," Sebastian said from the doorway. "Am I? She lied to me for months, made me believe she was something she wasn't. Did she? Or did you simply assume who she was based on her clothing and employment?" Sebastian moved into the room, pouring himself a generous brandy. "From what I observed, she never actually lied about anything. She simply didn't volunteer information about her background. The deception is the same. Is it? Because it seems to me that the woman you fell in love with, and don't bother denying it, I've known you too long. That woman was absolutely real. Her intelligence, her spirit, her feelings for you. That wasn't an act, Alex. That was Isabella." Alexander slammed his hand down on his desk. "How can I know that? How can I know what was real and what was performance?" "Because you do know. In your heart you know. You're just too afraid to trust that knowledge." Sebastian was right, and Alexander hated him for it. He did know. Isabella's feelings had been written in every glance, every blush, every moment of connection between them. But acknowledging that meant acknowledging his own feelings and the terrifying vulnerability that came with them. "It doesn't matter now," Alexander said finally. "She's gone. She doesn't have to be." But Alexander had already turned away, effectively ending the conversation. Sebastian left with a frustrated sigh, but not before muttering something about stubborn, blind dukes who deserved to be miserable. Days passed in a grey blur. Alexander threw himself into his estate business, his parliamentary duties, anything that might distract him from the growing emptiness in his chest. But Isabella's presence seemed to linger in every corner of Ravencrest Manor. Catherine moped about the house, rejecting her new governess at every turn and asking daily when Miss Isabella would return. "She won't," Alexander finally told his ward one evening when her questions became unbearable. "Lady Isabella has a different life now, one that doesn't include us." "But she was happy here," Catherine insisted with the stubborn logic of childhood. "I saw her smiling. She laughed all the time before she left." Why can't she be happy here and be rich too? Alexander had no answer for that, because the question cut too close to his own doubts. Meanwhile, in London, Isabella was discovering that wealth brought its own kind of prison. The Ashbridge mansion on Grosvenor Square was magnificent, her new wardrobe the height of fashion, and her social calendar filled with invitations from the ton's most influential families. Yet she had never felt more miserable in her life. "You're being courted by half the eligible bachelors in London," Margaret observed during one of her visits. "Lord Pemberton alone has sent enough flowers to stock a conservatory. And yet you look as though you're attending a funeral rather than being celebrated as the catch of the season." Isabella listlessly stirred her tea, not meeting her friend's concerned gaze. "I should be grateful, shouldn't I? This is what every young woman dreams of: wealth, freedom, choice in marriage. Should be, yes, but clearly aren't. This is about Ravencrest, isn't it?" At the mention of Alexander's name, Isabella felt the familiar sharp pain in her chest. What would be the point of discussing it? He made his feelings quite clear. Did he? Because Sebastian tells a different story. According to him, Alexander has been absolutely miserable since you left. Apparently, he's driven away 3 governesses in as many weeks, and he spends most of his time brooding in that library where you used to read together. Isabella's heart gave a traitorous leap of hope, which she quickly suppressed. It doesn't matter how he feels now. He doesn't trust me. He can't forgive the deception. Can you blame him, given his history with Lady Vivien? Isabella had heard the story, of course. Everyone in society knew about Alexander's ill-fated engagement 3 years prior. Lady Vivien Hartwell had pursued him relentlessly, convinced him of her love, only to be discovered in a compromising position with another man 2 weeks before their wedding. The revelation that she had been motivated purely by his title and fortune had shattered something in Alexander that had never fully healed. "I understand his suspicion," Isabella admitted, "but understanding it doesn't make it hurt any less. He looked at me as though I were no different from her, as though everything between us had been a calculated lie." "Perhaps," Margaret said carefully, "you need to show him the difference. Prove to him that your feelings were real." "How? He won't see me, won't respond to my letters. And even if he would, what could I say? That I love him? He's made it clear that my love is unwelcome." "Has he? Or has he simply made it clear that he's terrified to believe in it?" Before Isabella could respond to this unsettling question, her butler announced a visitor that made her blood run cold. "Lady Vivien Hartwell to see you, my lady." Vivien swept into the drawing room like a storm cloud, her dark beauty as striking as ever. She had always possessed the kind of dramatic appeal that made other women feel pale by comparison, and time had not diminished her impact. "Lady Isabella," Vivien purred, settling herself onto the sofa with practiced elegance. "How delightful to finally meet the mysterious governess who has captured so much attention." Isabella felt Margaret tense beside her, but she kept her own expression politely neutral. "Lady Vivien, to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? Oh, I think we both know why I'm here. You see, I've recently returned from the continent, and I've been hearing the most fascinating stories about your little adventure at Ravencrest Manor." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." Vivien's smile was sharp as a blade. "Come now, my dear, there's no need for pretense between us. We both know you were playing at being a governess while secretly being one of the wealthiest heiresses in England. It's really quite clever, I must admit, though I do wonder what poor Alexander thought when he discovered the truth." Isabella's hands clenched in her lap, but she maintained her composure. "The Duke's thoughts are his own concern." "Indeed they are. And I'm quite confident I know what those thoughts are." Vivien leaned forward conspiratorially. "You see, Alexander has always been painfully predictable. He craves control, order, certainty. When that certainty is threatened, as it was with both of us, he retreats behind his walls and refuses to come out. Both of us, Isabella repeated, though she dreaded the answer. Oh yes, my dear. I'm planning to renew my acquaintance with Alexander very soon. Now that I'm a widow and free to marry where I choose, I think he and I have unfinished business. The casual announcement hit Isabella like a physical blow. Vivien was free to marry, and she clearly intended to pursue Alexander again. The thought of them together, of Alexander finding solace in the arms of a woman who had once betrayed him, was almost unbearable. I see, Isabella managed. Well, I'm sure the Duke will make whatever choice serves him best. I'm sure he will. But I thought you should know, woman to woman, that he won't be alone much longer. Alexander may be stubborn, but he's also lonely, and loneliness makes people inflexible in their standards. With that parting shot, Vivien rose and glided from the room, leaving Isabella feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. That woman is poison, Margaret declared once they were alone. Pure, calculated poison. Isabella barely heard her friend's indignation. Her mind was spinning with the implications of Vivien's visit. Was she right? Would Alexander, in his pain and loneliness, turn to the familiar comfort of his former fiancée? The thought was devastating, but what could Isabella do to prevent it? He had made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with her. But perhaps Margaret had been right. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding behind pride and fear. Perhaps it was time to fight for what she wanted. Margaret, Isabella said suddenly, her voice gaining strength and determination. I need your help. Anything. What do you need? I need to get back to Ravencrest Manor, but not as Lady Isabella Ashbridge. I need to go back as myself, as the woman Alexander fell in love with, governess or not. Margaret's eyes lit up with understanding and approval. Now that sounds like the Isabella I know. What's your plan? Meanwhile, at Ravencrest Manor, Alexander was discovering that Vivien's letter announcing her intention to call on him had arrived at the worst possible time. He was already struggling with his feelings about Isabella, and the last thing he needed was a reminder of his previous romantic disaster. But when Vivien arrived on a cold December evening, wrapped in furs and looking every inch the sophisticated widow, Alexander found himself feeling nothing. No anger, no bitterness, no residual attraction, just a vague sense of weariness at having to deal with the past. Alexander, she purred, offering him her gloved hand to kiss. You look magnificent. Brooding clearly agrees with you. Vivien. He performed the expected courtesy but kept his distance. I was surprised to receive your letter. I thought you were settled in Paris. I was. But Paris grew tiresome without proper company, and I found myself thinking of home, of what I left behind. Alexander poured himself a brandy, not offering her one. What you left behind was a pile of ashes and broken promises, as I recall. I know you're angry. I'm not angry, Vivien. Anger requires investment, and I find I have none where you're concerned. His indifference clearly wasn't what she'd expected. She moved closer, her perfume heavy in the air. We both made mistakes, Alexander. We were young, foolish, but we're older now, wiser. We could begin again, could we? And what makes you think I'd want to? Because you're alone. Because despite all your wealth and power, you're lonely. I can see it in your eyes. She reached out to touch his arm, but he stepped away. You see what you want to see, Vivien. Nothing more. Do I? Then tell me about the governess. Alexander's entire body went still. What governess? Come now, Alexander. London society talks of nothing else. The Duke of Ravencrest, brought low by a servant girl who turned out to be richer than he is. It's quite the romantic tale. It's quite the fiction, Alexander said coldly. Is it? Because I've met your Isabella and she seems quite devastated by your rejection, quite convinced that she's lost the love of her life. Despite himself, Alexander felt his control slip. "You've spoken to her?" "Oh, yes. Lovely girl, quite beautiful when she's not hiding behind governess garb, and clearly head over heels in love with you. It's really rather touching, if one believes in such things." Alexander turned away, unable to hide his reaction. "What did you say to her?" "Nothing untruthful, simply that you and I had history, that I was free to marry now, and intended to renew our acquaintance." Vivien's voice took on a calculating edge. "I may have implied that you were receptive to the idea." "You had no right, didn't I? You rejected her, Alexander. You sent her away. What did you expect her to think?" Alexander felt rage building in his chest, not at Isabella, but at himself. At his pride, his fear, his stubborn refusal to acknowledge what his heart had been telling him for weeks. "Get out," he said quietly. "Alexander, get out of my house, now, and don't contact me again." Vivien's mask slipped, showing the calculating coldness beneath. "You're making a mistake. She'll never trust you again after how you treated her. She'll marry one of her countless suitors and forget you ever existed." Her words hit their mark, exactly as she'd intended. But instead of driving Alexander back to her, they had the opposite effect. The thought of Isabella marrying someone else, of some other man claiming her heart and her life, was unbearable. After Vivien left, Alexander found himself pacing his study like a caged wolf. How had he made such a mess of everything? Isabella had indeed entered his heart, completely and irrevocably. He loved her, had loved her when he thought she was a governess, loved her still now that he knew she was an heiress. Her deception hadn't changed the essence of who she was or what she meant to him, but had he realized this too late? He was still wrestling with these thoughts when Mrs. Henderson appeared in his doorway with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Your Grace, there's a young woman at the servants' entrance asking for work. Says she's a governess, looking for a position." Alexander felt his heart stop. "At this hour? She says she's travelled from London and had nowhere else to go. She seems respectable, Your Grace. And she specifically asked about the position caring for Lady Catherine." Alexander's hands were trembling as he set down his brandy glass. Could it be? Would Isabella dare? "Show her to the morning room," he instructed, his voice rough with emotion. I'll interview her myself." Alexander made his way to the morning room with his heart hammering against his ribs. When he pushed open the door, his breath caught in his throat. Isabella stood by the window, wearing the same simple grey dress she'd worn the day they met. Her hair was pulled back in the practical style of a governess, and she held herself with the quiet dignity that had first attracted his attention. But there was something different about her now, a resolve, a determination that hadn't been there before. "Miss Thornfield," he said softly, hardly daring to believe she was real. She turned, and he saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your Grace, I heard you were in need of a governess." "Isabella." Her name was a prayer on his lips. "Why are you here?" "Because I realized something after I left. I realized that I was exactly who I claimed to be when I lived in this house. Not Lady Isabella Ashbridge, heiress and socialite, but Isabella Thornfield, a woman who found herself, found happiness, found love in these halls." Alexander took a step closer, afraid to hope. "And what of your inheritance, your position in society? What of it? Money can't hold me at night when I'm lonely. A title can't make me laugh when I'm sad. Social position can't argue politics with me by the fire or challenge me to be better than I am." Her voice broke slightly. "Only you can do those things. Only you ever have. Isabella, please let me finish. I know I hurt you by not telling you the truth from the beginning. I know I damaged your trust, and I know you have every right to send me away. But I had to try. I had to come back and tell you that everything I felt, everything between us, was real. My circumstances were false, but my heart never was." Alexander felt the last of his defenses crumble. This brave, beautiful woman had given up everything, wealth, position, security, to come back to him, to fight for them. "You fool," he whispered, reaching for her hands. "You beautiful, magnificent fool. Don't you know that none of that matters? Your money, your title, none of it changes how I feel about you." Isabella's eyes widened with hope. How do you feel about me?" "I love you," he said simply. "I love your quick mind and your stubborn pride. I love the way you argue with me and refuse to be intimidated by my title. I love how you made Catherine laugh, how you brought warmth to this cold house. I've loved you since that first night in the library when you told me Byron was naive about love." Tears spilled down Isabella's cheeks as she looked up at him. "But you said I would never enter your heart." Alexander cupped her face gently, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "I was wrong. You didn't just enter my heart, Isabella. You conquered it completely. You made me realize that all my walls, all my defenses, were just fear, dressed up as wisdom. And Vivien, she said she intended to renew your acquaintance. Vivien is my past, a mistake I won't repeat." His voice grew fierce with certainty. "You are my future, if you'll have me." Isabella's smile was radiant through her tears. "Alexander, I've been miserable without you. Every ball, every suitor, every moment of my new life felt empty because you weren't there to share it with." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her as though she might disappear if he loosened his grip. The scent of her hair, the warmth of her body against his, it felt like coming home after a long, dark journey. "Marry me," he whispered against her hair. "Not because you're an heiress, not because society expects it, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Isabella pulled back to look at him, her eyes shining. "Are you certain? Because if we do this, there's no hiding from society. They'll talk, they'll speculate about our courtship. Let them talk. I'm done caring what anyone thinks, except you." He kissed her forehead tenderly. "Though I suspect Lady Margaret will be insufferably smug about being right." Isabella laughed, the sound like music after so many days of silence in the manor. "She's been quite vocal about your stubbornness, actually. She and Sebastian have apparently been plotting to throw us together at the Christmas ball." "Have they indeed?" Alexander's eyes danced with mischief. "Then perhaps we should surprise them by arriving together. As an engaged couple? If you'll say yes." Isabella stood on her tiptoes and kissed him softly, pouring all her love and hope into the gentle contact. "Yes, Alexander, yes to everything." When they finally broke apart, breathless and grinning like fools, Alexander kept her hands clasped tightly in his. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said long ago." "What is it?" "You were never just a governess to me. From that very first day, you challenged everything I thought I knew about class, about worth, about what makes a person valuable. You made me question my prejudices, made me want to be better than I was." Isabella's eyes filled with fresh tears. "You made me want to be brave, to stop hiding from life, from love, from the possibility of being hurt. And now I know that love isn't about avoiding pain. It's about finding someone worth risking everything for." Alexander was about to respond when the door burst open and Catherine came running in, still in her nightgown and with her hair in braids. "Miss Isabella! Mrs. Henderson said you were back." The little girl launched herself at Isabella, who caught her in a fierce embrace. "Hello, sweetheart. Did I wake you?" "I couldn't sleep. I've been watching from my window every night, hoping you'd come back." Catherine looked between Isabella and her guardian with sharp eyes. "Papa, you look different." "Happy different." Alexander knelt down to Catherine's level. "That's because Miss Isabella, Lady Isabella, has agreed to marry me." Catherine's squeal of delight could probably be heard in the next county. "Really? Truly? You're going to be my mama?" Isabella's heart clenched with emotion as she looked at this child who had become so dear to her. "If you'd like me to be." "Like it? I've been praying for it every night." Catherine turned to Alexander with satisfaction. "I told you she made you happy, Papa. I told you she belonged here." "You did indeed, little one. You're much wiser than your old guardian." Sebastian chose that moment to arrive, having ridden through the night after receiving an urgent message from Margaret about Isabella's departure from London. He appeared in the doorway, travel-stained and breathless, only to find the three of them embracing by the fireplace. "Well," he said, leaning against the doorframe with a grin, "I can see my dramatic midnight rescue mission was unnecessary." "Sebastian!" Alexander rose, keeping one arm around Isabella. "What are you doing here?" "Margaret sent word that our Isabella had disappeared from London with only a cryptic note about setting things right. We were terrified she'd done something foolish." His grin widened as he took in the scene. "Though this appears to be foolish in the best possible way." "She came back," Alexander said simply, as though those three words contained all the wonder in the world. "So I see. And judging by the fact that you're both glowing like lanterns, I assume the grand gesture worked." Isabella blushed prettily. "We're engaged." Sebastian let out a whoop of joy and strode forward to embrace them both. "Finally! Do you know how insufferable you've both been? Alex brooding about the library like some gothic hero, and you, my dear Isabella, moping through London ballrooms like a tragic heroine. It's been exhausting to watch." "We weren't that bad," Isabella protested. "Weren't you? Margaret has been plotting intervention strategies for weeks. She'll be beside herself with joy when she hears." Catherine, who had been bouncing with excitement, suddenly grew serious. "But what about all those other men who want to marry Lady Isabella? The ones who send flowers?" Isabella knelt down and took Catherine's hands gently. "None of them matter, sweetheart. The heart chooses what it chooses, and mine chose your papa long ago, even when he was being grumpy and mean." "Especially then," Isabella said, with a fond look at Alexander, "because underneath all that gruffness was a man worth loving." Alexander felt his chest tighten with emotion. How had he ever thought he could live without this woman, without this warmth and joy she brought to everything she touched? "Speaking of which," Sebastian interjected with characteristic timing, "you should probably know that Lady Vivien has been spreading rather interesting stories about her visit here. Something about renewing old attachments." Alexander's expression darkened. "Vivien can spread whatever stories she likes. The only attachment I'm interested in renewing is the one that was never truly broken." He looked down at Isabella with infinite tenderness. "The one that was only temporarily misplaced due to my own stubborn pride." "Good," Sebastian said with satisfaction, "because Margaret is already planning the wedding of the century. Apparently, she's been keeping a list of ideas in case this day ever came." "A list?" Isabella asked with some alarm. "Pages and pages. Flowers, music, guest lists organized by political affiliation and potential for scandal." Sebastian's eyes twinkled with mischief. "She's quite thorough," Alexander groaned. "Perhaps we should elope." "Don't you dare," Catherine said fiercely. "I want to be the flower girl. I want to wear a beautiful dress and throw petals and watch you get married properly." Isabella and Alexander exchanged a look of amused surrender. "Very well, sweetheart. A proper wedding it shall be." "Oh, with dancing? Lots of dancing. And cake? The biggest cake in Yorkshire." Catherine clapped her hands in delight, then yawned hugely as the excitement and late hour caught up with her. "Come on, little one," Sebastian said, scooping her up. "Let's get you back to bed before you fall asleep standing up. Your papa and Isabella probably have some catching up to do." After Sebastian carried Catherine upstairs, Alexander and Isabella found themselves alone again in the flickering firelight. The magnitude of what had just happened, the promises made, the future stretching out before them, settled around them like a warm embrace. "I can hardly believe you're really here," Alexander said, pulling her close again. Part of me is afraid I'll wake up and find this was all a dream. It's real, Isabella assured him, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. We're real. This is real. Alexander caught her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, over his heart. Do you feel that? That's what you do to me. That's what you've always done to me from that very first day. Isabella felt the strong, steady rhythm beneath her palm and marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. All the pain, all the misunderstandings, all the pride and fear, it had all led here to this perfect understanding between them. I love you, Alexander Blackthorne, she said solemnly. Not your title, not your wealth, not your position in society. I love the man who argues politics by candlelight and worries about his ward's happiness and tries so hard to protect his heart that he nearly breaks it instead. And I love you, Isabella Thornfield, he replied, using the name she'd chosen for herself rather than the one she'd inherited. The woman brave enough to choose her own path, strong enough to stand up to a duke's arrogance, and generous enough to forgive a fool's mistakes. They kissed then, slowly and deeply, sealing the promises they'd made. When they finally parted, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. You know, he said with a soft chuckle, I told you that you would never enter my heart. Isabella smiled, her eyes sparkling with mischief. You did indeed. How wrong you were. Completely wrong. Because you didn't just enter my heart, my love. You claimed it, conquered it, and made it entirely yours. And what a territory it turned out to be, Isabella said teasingly. Vast, well-defended, and absolutely worth the siege. Alexander laughed, the sound rich and warm in the quiet room. A siege, was it? I prefer to think of it as a strategic surrender to superior forces. Oh, it was definitely a conquest, complete and unconditional. As they stood there in each other's arms, both could feel the rightness of this moment, this choice, this love that had survived deception and pride and fear to emerge stronger than ever. Outside, snow began to fall softly against the windows, blanketing Ravencrest Manor in pristine white, a clean slate, a fresh beginning. In the weeks that followed, London society would indeed talk. They would speculate about the whirlwind romance between the Duke of Ravencrest and the mysterious heiress who had hidden in plain sight. They would debate the propriety of a noblewoman taking employment, the wisdom of marrying for love rather than advantage, the scandal of a duke choosing passion over protocol. But none of that mattered to Alexander and Isabella. They had found something far more valuable than social approval. They had found each other, and in doing so, had discovered that true love really could transcend every barrier society tried to place between them. When spring came to Yorkshire, it would bring with it wedding bells, and the laughter of a child who had gained not just a mother, but the joy of watching two people she loved find happiness together. It would bring new life to Ravencrest Manor, new warmth to halls that had been cold too long. And in the library where it all began, where a governess and a duke had first sparred over poetry and politics, there would always be two chairs by the fire, proof that sometimes the heart knows what it wants long before the mind is wise enough to listen. The Duke had been wrong after all. Isabella had entered his heart completely. And in doing so, she had shown him that love, real, honest, transformative love, was not a weakness to be guarded against, but a strength to be embraced. In the end, it wasn't wealth or title or social position that mattered. It was the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to forgive, and the faith to believe that some things, the very best things, are worth fighting for. Their love story would become legend in the ballrooms and drawing rooms of London, a tale told and retold of the Duke who thought his heart was impenetrable and the heiress who proved him wrong in the most beautiful way possible. But to Alexander and Isabella themselves, it was simply the beginning of their greatest adventure, a lifetime of love, laughter, and the quiet joy of two hearts that had finally found their home in each other.